because I do think that is important.
Neville Boston Reviver. Texas, for instance, there's a watermark that they have that like rotates, so you're able to know by that watermark that it's actually a legal plate. We have no problem, working with CHP to have some kind of overlay, or DMV to figure out, to make sure that people know that this is a legal plate, based on that. And we can do that with technology. So, I mean, it's something that's, can be visible depending on the angle and things of that nature. So, we're open to working collaboratively to make sure that there isn't, an issue when it comes to that. To my knowledge, Kip, and please correct me if I'm wrong, we haven't had any of those issues, but I mean, it's not saying that it wouldn't come. And just to get ahead of it, I think it may be something that we should look into and figure out what that needs to look like.
Okay, great. And I do know there are other products that are not electronic that we probably need to look at, like you were saying, Nick, about adhesives and things like that. I do know with our clean air decals and some indicia that we as DMV issue, when you pull it off, there it shows void. So we've got that, but yeah, we should look into a watermark or something that would help instill confidence that the product is legal. So, yeah, okay, great. And I think we did turn off the live feed, but I do want to pop in and check with Frank from time to time to see if any questions have come into the email box.
It's all related to the live feed, the aspect of the live feed. Trying to address those.
Or lack thereof.
Okay, so I do have I think the last one that's kind of wrapping up the pilot questions and kind of as we transition to permanent. I'm wondering what we do with the current products that are out there under a pilot. What do we have them do to become permanent? What kind of, and again, for any pilot product, what kind of thresholds do we have for them? What does the transition process look like? I know the statute allows us to offer temporary authority to the current pilot products. But I kind of want thoughts on, well, not kind of, I want thoughts on what the transition looks like from both the existing vendor perspective as well as a new vendor who went through a pilot and then transitioning. Does the group have any thoughts on that? Okay, well, we'll think about it and see what we can come up with. But again, this does tie to transition more broadly. If we have a pilot product on a vehicle, what do we do as it transitions to a permanent authorized product related to the consumer? So we've got to look at it from the perspective of, is there a different coding that's on the right? I mean, how do we help everybody become aware that the product is now permanently authorized?
Neville Boston from Reviver. I can't speak for everybody, but the license plate and the way that it was set up was to, look like it's legal.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I'm not sure this really relates to that because it never said temporary on it.
Okay.
So when people look at it, they look at it as a license plate.
Okay.
So I'm not sure on the actual physical plate that any change needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of the indication internally that you would know that this has gone from a pilot program to an actual full legal program. And I don't know what the DMV or CHP sends out as far as communication and how often. But I mean, like any partner, you would want to, work in concert to make sure that whatever messaging is going out is consistent kind of across the board so that everybody knows that it is, a real program. So I don't know if it's joint messaging. I have no idea, but it's something to think about. Like, when something transitions from being a pilot to, a fully legal program,
Mm-hmm.
there should be messaging that goes out that lets everybody know. And if it's going to be with DMV or CHP, then, whatever that product is should be listed somewhere. So I don't know if you create, another site or there's somewhere on there where like, hey, this is actually a legal product. because they're going to go to you as a, an area of truth, and if it's not there, then they're going to question it, and you're going to get more questions about it. So it's just something to think about, how you make that transition from being, a pilot to, permanent.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, I think the flip side of that is, what do we do when a pilot is not successful? How do we revoke the authorization? How do we revoke those? What burden is on the state versus what burden is on the vendor? So that's a process we have to contemplate as well. So curious about if there are any thoughts there. And again, I know we're in this session now, but when things pop into your mind, like 2 o'clock in the morning, like things happen to me, I mean, you are always welcome to email that DMV ROD registration policy email box. We monitor that, so you're always welcome to send, I was gonna say a treatise, but please don't, so. Bullet points are good, long bullet points, but yeah, your feedback is really important, and I know some of these questions you might be hearing for the first time, so. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and move on to page 3 unless there are any other questions, Frank, that have come through, like questions not about the live stream?
No.
Okay, so the next section actually is about consumers and businesses. One of the requirements of the statute is to ensure that participation is voluntary. So how does the state do that? And how do we ensure consumer participation is voluntary at a third-party location, like a dealership? What about used vehicles? I might have a license plate, well, I'll say alternative product, I'm not trying to call it anything. I might have a digital plate. I might have an alternative product on my vehicle, but I go to sell it. Who has to do what in that situation? And tied to this, does the state monitor how participants are obtained? And I think the answer is no to this question, or none, but what role should the state have in overseeing outreach and marketing? It's private sector, that's market driven. I'm not inclined to deal with that unless there are privacy and some other consumer, well, not privacy per se, but consumer protection issues related to that. But Esteban, hello.
Esteban from Reviver. I would say, just to the first question, to ensuring it's voluntary, by sending customers metal plates, you're ensuring that it's an opt-in sort of model, at least as it relates to digital license plates, right? So it thus makes the program voluntary in essence, but that's just specific to digital license plates.
Okay, thank you.
I would just ask if any of the vendors out there, if you have any guidance or that you've given your customers when one of your products has been either stolen or vandalized, or what guidance you've given them, or if you've experienced that.
So in reference to what we're giving Kiploving Reviver, to the customer or to law enforcement?
To the customer.
So customer service, if they're notified of a stolen vehicle involving a digital plate, customer service goes through a process, customer service within Reviver goes through a process that allows, that confirms that there's a police report on file in that process, and we give them the guidance to make sure if they haven't reported it, and we walk them through that. And then on the internal side of Reviver, then we go through a process to try to locate that vehicle using the technologies based on what type of plate they might have.
And then I know you mentioned law enforcement too. Are you also giving guidance on your classes that you offer?
Absolutely. There's a subpoena compliance guide that law enforcement, that Reviver put together and law enforcement has access to. And that walks through a number of different scenarios that law enforcement would have to go through the court process to get information involving a plate. If they have cooperation from the victim, then of course it's expedited to a different level. Fast forward, we have had a couple of cases involving law enforcement And one particular involved a stolen embezzled vehicle. The stolen message was pushed down to the plate, and of all agencies, California Highway Patrol was responsible for the location and recovery of the vehicle. And so, back to your training question, the real live scenarios, we walk through those in classes and make sure officers have a clear understanding of what other officers ran into, and then make sure we answer any questions that might come up.
Great, thank you.
So, I was just reminded, we did have, to date, we've had 2 search warrants served on Reviver related to criminal cases. And I want to point out, one of them was a LPR read involving a flock camera that picked up a vehicle leaving the scene of a homicide. And the officers were able to recognize the flock return as a digital license plate, and then reached out to us at that point.
Thank you. I think just an overall question, you don't have to answer it, but just an overall question to think about is, does current statute cover what would happen with a Reviver plate as property on a vehicle or a plate on a vehicle? And does the regulation need to address anything further because it's an alternate registration device? Or is current statute sufficient?
That list of questions, that's number 2, is involving the it's number 2 or 3, the question that's asked by law enforcement, hey, since this is personal property, how do we deal with this? And at this point, we say that that's something that we kick back to you guys. Hey, we'll respond. We've received a number of suggestions to, hey, just make it a blank screen, which we can do. There's a number of things that we can do on the technology side. But that is a question that continues to come up from law enforcement.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could piggyback, that's really interesting, because we have a section that goes into privacy and security, but it does talk about those messages that you mentioned, Kip, where it says stolen. And then, like, I know historically there have been conversations about maybe using it for Amber Alerts or Silver Alerts or something like that. Now, I'm curious about that statute. At least as I read it, seemed to indicate that the sequence needs to be displayed. But, you know, we can explore that a little bit further. But I'm curious about, and I think where this question germinated for me was in the privacy and security piece, where about DMV, the department, is not to receive or retain information generated because of the program regarding the movement, location, or use of any vehicle participating in the program. So that tells me that DMV isn't supposed to get the information, but my question is, what about law enforcement? Again, is there a way that, and/or is it appropriate to use any alternative registration product to message stolen, or even, like we were saying, expired? Or, I mean, is there anything there that we want to explore in the regulations?
I would think that current existing law, whether it be statute or case law, likely covers those questions.
Okay.
And I think, as Kip mentioned, it would be based upon the circumstances surrounding the instrument that was on the vehicle.
Yeah, and this is S1 with Reviver. I would also say the bill went through a number of iterations, and this was, I think that portion of the bill was written prior to the passage of the privacy agency's regulations. And so obviously we think those standards are probably going to suffice well enough, and I know there's a provision in the bill that says the alternative products had to adhere to those standards. So.
That's true. Thank you, Esteban. Ties a little bit to privacy, but I'm jumping back up to E. How does the state ensure registered users of a device are aware of GPS capability and that and the uses, and they can deactivate the function? How do we ensure that?
Neville Boston from Reviver. So for our product in particular, the majority of the plates that are out there are battery-operated products which do not have GPS. The GPS, for the most part, is mostly used with fleets.
Okay.
So with that being said, the GPS information can be shut off inside the app, and and that's basically on the user if they want to, turn off that transmission of that information. And that information is not sent to anybody. It's information that, they have control over. Same way that you have with your cell phone. If I was lost and needed some help and I went to Google to help get directions, I would put that on, and then, at such time that I didn't need it, I could choose to turn it off. So that's completely, up to the user on how they want to utilize it.
Okay. And well, you brought up fleets, or businesses, if you will. Statute is pretty clear. It outlines a lot related to employer-employee use of the technology, the GPS technology. I'm wondering if there's anything missing for fleets or business use cases that we might need to address in regulation. So I'm putting that out there, the community can think about it and use the email box if you have any suggestions on that item. I don't know if you guys saw anything that might be missing. I just want to make sure we're covering all of our bases.
Does there need to be a tiered approach within the regulations? Because we have some of the alternative registration devices that are, for example, to use maybe not the best term, but low-tech versus high-tech. So that if we're going to talk about security and privacy concerns, how much of that really applies to a license plate wrap versus a plate that has digital information in it. And then a tiered approach seems best, but just a concept to think about.
No, that's a great point, because there are products out there that wouldn't have all these digital components. So I appreciate that. Definitely we'll need to look at low/no tech or the high tech solution. So thank you. Let's see, moving on to cost.
Oh, can I add one thing?
Yeah,
I don't know if this is the
absolutely.
best place for it, but whether it's
Doesn't matter.
whether it's a higher tech device or a lower tech device, is there any type of third party, or is DMV considered a third party to validate I know we talked about testing that the Highway Patrol does, but at the end of the day, is there a like an SAE type of entity out there that could be added to the substantiation or the validation process? So that way, when a device is brought forward to, for example, the Highway Patrol for that test, which is required by statute, would it be easier to say that a third-party type of standard, or even is there an industry that's out there for alternate registration devices to make it easier for vendors that are here to meet those? I know that we talked about AMVA a little bit, but just wondering if there's something that can be written into regulation so when those do come forward, that they're at a point where if we have ALPR standards or whatever it might be that we're testing for, but it would help anyone who brought it forward at that point be more successful when they came forward, but also to say that before you come forward, you got to be at this point. Just what the concepts are, thoughts are.
Neville Boston from Reviver. It's been a conversation around it. AMVA has a license plate working group that is dealing, with some of those things, and it's always best practices, not necessarily that they're setting the standards, whether it's SAE or it's NIST or there's a couple other agencies that do this. That would be interesting. I know that in Texas, we tested with TTI, which is Texas A&M's, in order for us to, pass their standards. So, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I think, third-party validation is, something that, could be a part of it. But I've had several conversations, and I know that AMVA is looking at doing some, LPR, updating the standard that they had done, I think, 15 years ago. When they were, looking at, different plates and its readability and things of that nature. So there could be something there, just figuring out who's the best party to do it and how it would be done.
Right, and I think too that you brought the TTI study, and that's a good one to look at too, because you know, definitions are very important in there too, and what TTI looks at versus what California statute has, and even small definitions like reflectivity versus retro reflectivity that we see on these plates, and thinking about how that works. And so, again, yeah, that third-party concept and how it would exist. And I want to say that one of the examples I asked in the other workshop I was involved in, and that was related to automated driving systems, is that when someone comes to me and says, hey, our product works, like, well,
What does that mean?
what does that mean? That means different things to different vendors. And what's that validation? So this is a unique industry at this point, but I would imagine that it's probably not far off before other vendors with digital plates, or maybe they're already out there, right? But other ones come forward and they say, well, mine works too, and mine works, and mine works. Well, what does that mean?
Right. I think one of the issues that I was bringing up before, and maybe I wasn't as articulate, is that it's a really difficult space to be in to start talking about, you know, LPRs, ALPRs, because there isn't a standard of visibility in that industry, because everybody's different. There's probably 20 different camera companies, and they could all read differently. And if there was a standard for when they were utilized, you know, in particular states, because I look at it from the perspective of, if you're doing traffic enforcement, there's money tied to that. So their ability to read, you know, is 98, 99%, because they're trying to get as much revenue in. I think, you know, that's not how CHP makes its decisions, or other law enforcement agencies, in regards to that. So I just think that it's a little bit problematic, because there isn't a standard that's been set when it comes to how these cameras and camera companies, how their technology should be read. So I think that's something that probably needs to be thought about and figured out, how that actually really works, because whether it's a flat plate, whether it's an embossed plate, whether it's reflective or retroreflective, there's all variations, and it should be able to read everything. You know, because I can take my iPhone out and take pictures, and it'll be able to read it and give me back information on it. So why wouldn't cameras do the same thing? And you're talking about spending thousands of dollars on cameras that should be able to read everything.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Frank, are we still pretty good on the comments? They're not, okay, yeah, okay. All right. One consideration from the statute is that the state is to establish reasonable fees to reimburse the department for the cost to implement the program. I would argue, and I may have edited it, but to reimburse the state for the cost of reimbursing, or for the cost of the program. Because yes, DMV has a role, but CHP also plays a vital role in terms of testing the products that are gonna be used in lieu of license plates or anything on the vehicle. So we wanna make sure that the state is made whole. So what is a fee structure? I mean, we have to go through our budgeting process to figure out what that looks like from our end, but I wanna put it out there to the group to kind of talk about the factors we should consider when developing the fees. And, you know, we can talk later, because we've got to do our budget analyses, but I'm just curious if the group is aware of like fee structures in other states or something, or has seen movement on costs in other states or what have you, and wants to make sure that, you know, hey, this is reasonable, this isn't reasonable, that kind of thing, before we start putting some fiscal impacts into regulatory language.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think to your point, Denise, too, and I get careful how I speak, but right now, when DMV has a vehicle that's titled and registered, you know, assuming that the vehicle is, at some point, the title will have to be printed and mailed out, whether that's someone bought it outright or they're on a payment plan. But one thing's for sure is a registration card is printed and is mailed out, as are the decals, the indicia that go on there.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is the baseline cost. And so if any product that comes in, and I think one of the topics that's addressed is savings to the state, more efficiency for the state, it has to be more efficient to the state. And so that baseline is 2 metal plates, and we can talk about prison industries, and we can talk about what the costs are to do those. We can do all that. We can, right, those numbers are all available. So at the end of the day, all that process never involves the highway patrol, because those plates are approved. I mean, if a new plate comes out, then certainly we get involved, but any plate that's currently authorized doesn't involve us. And so if new products come out, then we get involved because we have to have those readability tests. And so, again, and then even going beyond that, if there's devices that are needed to exchange information with law enforcement, am I looking at cost as a police agency? Are any police department, from our largest ones to our smallest ones, are they looking at a cost? And so we want to think about that if there are costs that come into it, and whether it's be during a pilot portion or down the road, it has to be based off, it should be saving versus those 2 metal plates and 2 stickers or 2 stickers with the first year and 1 every year after that. Or is that unreasonable?
Neville Boston, Reviver. That's an interesting question, and I fully understand and appreciate and support, being made whole. I think it's a different question. I would look at it from the perspective of, what is allowed to be done? Like, should you have a printed, tag sent if you can get it digitally? And then you figure out like how that information could be transferred. So we need to actually talk about processes, because I think there's a lot of redundancy that could be removed. But if you don't remove the redundancy, then the costs, of course, are going to go up. So you've got to figure out what, the state is willing to do. And then if you're willing to take the savings in this particular way, or if you feel like the information is safe when it's going out, I think those conversations are important conversations to have, because there could be tremendous savings depending on what is allowed to be done. If you're saying that it has to stay the same way that it's being done, and this is in addition to it, then you're never going to save anything. But if you're saying that information could be transferred in a different way, then yeah, there could definitely be savings. And then when it comes to like testing and doing things like that, it's also thinking about like how should the testing be done, and how long does it need to be done and what needs to be done. So I think clarifying those points are important points to be able to have clarity on, so that you're making sure that when you're engaging, that you're engaging in an intelligent way, and you're not just engaging on one item, you're engaging on several, so you can get them all done at the same time, as opposed to having to come back one at a time. Because just to be honest, some of the issues that we've run into when we try to do testing with the CHP is that we wanted to test a bunch of things at the same time, and we were told that if it's not in statute or if it's not in regulation, then we're not going to test it. Which means that you've got to go back, do that, and then come back and test. So doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So I think if we can put together the processes and we make a decision on this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it, it makes it easier on everybody, and you're able to do things more efficiently. So I think it's not just what's the baseline. It's like, what are we willing to change on the baseline in order to make it more efficient on both sides?
Yep, and I would ask this to any of the vendors, but if there was a direct cost to you to have that testing because it involved personnel that had to stay on overtime or whatever it might be, or it would more than likely we can talk about this obviously at some point, but you talked about, who do I contact? And so I think, this is a DMV product, so DMV should be the driver of the process overall, and then we are the consultants based on what's in the statute. And so if we get to the point, then if Denise calls and says, hey, Reviver needs to test some products, and I say, okay, what date, times, whatever work out, and so we come up with a point, I say, okay, well, it's going to take 2 or 3 personnel, and here's the reimbursable services rate, and I bill Denise for that, and then at some point, you get billed for that. Is that something that, this is just your opinion, I know, but what does the industry think that if there's a cost to testing?
I think that you accept it. It's a cost of doing business, so you would build it in, but it's got to be fair. I mean, and that's another thing too. I've seen some some potential costs from some states on things that they're doing, and it's just mind blowing. It doesn't really make sense. It's because their systems are built in a particular way, and there's zero flexibility. So instead of having 5 people in the meeting, you have 30. And why are 30 people in the meeting when only 3 people are talking? So you've got to. I think that there's just processes on how things are done that make sense, and then otherwise that don't make any sense whatsoever. And you can never get ahead of it if you're doing things the way that that you've always done them. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
I think, just to add a little bit to that conversation, I think one of the challenges becomes that I agree with you, there needs to be there needs to be a fine line somewhere, right? Because as a law enforcement agency, we get a lot of folks that come to us and say, hey, here's my idea, now tell me everything I need to do to get this going, right? And we hear that a lot, especially, I'm not throwing down the autonomous world, but for autonomous vehicles, they have an idea, they have a trailer, they have something that they come to us and they say, here's our drawing on a napkin, now tell us everything we need to do. And so we need to kind of stay away from that portion of it, but I agree with you, there does need to be some part of it where at some point we become involved in that and begin with the testing. I would say that, you know, in the initial phases, and I think that's what Nick was alluding to, as you're getting things up and going, that ownership has to be on the company to do their research, to get independent testing, and to make sure that it's a viable idea that is gonna move forward and potentially, you know, create a new space in what we do. But I agree, there has to be a conversation to say where those responsibilities are delineated. But the challenge that we see, and maybe the reason you got the response that, hey, if it's not already legislated that it's allowed, then we're not gonna be involved, is because we get so many of those requests that are, hey, you're the highway patrol, now tell us what we need to do. So we try to balance that the best that we can, and I'm sure it's not perfect, but that's our view of it.
No, I completely understand, and that makes total sense. What we, I think, have really tried to pride ourselves on is that we do a ton of research and make sure that, you know, the things that we're talking about, we believe are part of the program that we were looking to be involved in. So, and you're right, it's on the company to make sure that you've done the homework, that you know what you're talking about, that you've done the research, so that you're not wasting anybody's time, because time is money, and I completely agree. There's a lot of other more important things that you could be doing, and, you know, we don't want to waste anybody's time. But I think what's really important is that if we're, you know, committed to making changes, smart changes, the right kinds of changes, then we've got to kind of do it across the board. And then when there are potholes that we maybe haven't seen, but you guys do know, would be important to come, because we'll do 95% of the work, but there may be 5% that we don't know. So it's like, well, guys, if you want to change how we send out, say, registration cards, or how we send out tags, or whatever it is, these are the changes that you would actually have to make in order for us to even have this conversation. So you're putting it back on the company to say, okay, if this is what we believe needs to be done and it's going to be effective, then this is the work that we have to do in order for us to get to a place where we can actually get those things done. So, and we're very mindful of that. You know, 10 years has been a long time. So it's like we've learned a lot, and we've learned the good things, bad things, and everything in between. So it's important for us to, you know, be smart about what we're doing, but also to respect, you know, what you guys have to do as well.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. One thing in the regulations development process, as we were brainstorming, kind of talking about cost again, and this one is the consumer piece. Does the state have a role in vendor-to-consumer pricing, or should it be wholly market-driven? What role does the state have in ensuring consumer protection related to pricing? I spent some time in the private sector, so the private sector side of me is like, it's wholly market-driven, but I think that there are some things that we'll want to talk about as a state. Neville, you mentioned earlier that some of the states have incredible costing that you're like, what? So I want to make sure that if we have a role here, that we're smart about it and just, you know.
Well, it's Neville Boston from Reviver. It's an alternative product for a reason. Like, so it's like you don't have to use it. There
Right.
is something that you can use.
Okay.
So I, you know, believe that it should be market-driven because you're not being forced to use it. It would be different if the state said, listen, tomorrow we're changing all plates and they're going to be this. So, yeah, if it's going to impact you financially and this is the only product that you can use, completely understand. But I think outside of that, it's a decision that somebody chooses to make. And if they choose to make that decision, then they choose to bear those costs because, you know, we're transparent about it, just like I think anybody else would be, the wraps or, you know, if you're talking about the registration, you know, if that's an additional cost, then you've decided to bore that cost.
Okay, thank you. All right, the next section does deal with privacy and security. We've talked about it throughout the session this morning. The pieces, though, that I think we want to make sure we cover specifically. We've got to determine data sharing, privacy, and security protocols, and how that works with GPS and other technologies. I know there's guidance, and Esteban, thank you for reminding me that there is a privacy piece in the statute related to the standards that exist in the privacy statutes. But, you know, we're really gonna need to look at what data sharing looks like. Who can we share this data with? What data? I mean, we've gotta be mindful of personally identifiable information, those kinds of things. And the statute does require us to, ensure that the vehicle location technology can be disabled. So how do we monitor that? I think vehicle to owner is one thing, but vehicle to owner to my son's driving my car, or I lent my car to my friend, or what have you. So how do we manage that? I think that's a little bit of an interesting nuance there. So, those are just things that we're contemplating. So if the group has thoughts now, happy to hear them. Otherwise, if you get that 2:00 in the morning inspiration, drop us an email. Happy to consider your thoughts there. We talked a little bit already about fraud prevention and product misuse. Some of the questions that came up were, what steps should the state take to prevent fraud or product misuse? What should the state do when it's made aware of such fraud or abuse? What should the state do when it becomes aware of a product malfunction? And within what time frame does the vendor need to tell us about a product malfunction? And what about their correction plans, the remedy plans? So what does that look like?
Kip Loving, Reviver. I just wanted, on the fraud side, let you know some things that Reviver has already done, and it's already paid off. And then also let you know some law enforcement feedback that are some ideas that they have that could maybe help on the counterfeit side. Some of our first initial trainings were instigated and requested by Department of Motor Vehicles investigations units. And we've done a number of trainings for them across the state. We hosted one here in Sacramento involving a number of offices. And so I wanted to share with you some of the feedback as far as validate, so those trainings have assisted with them reaching out to Reviver at different times on what they're seeing out in the field. And fortunately, to date, there hasn't been anything, any major concerns that have come up. But I also want to point out some ideas that have been brought up by not only DMV investigators, but also by CHP and other agencies, asking, hey, can you do a barcode or a QR code in a small area on the plate that we can go up and just validate it? Could you do the last 3 or 4 of the VIN on, in the corner of the plate? And all the questions, all the answers to those questions are absolutely. It's a digital display. We can do that. And we can, so just to let you know, we have been getting feedback from law enforcement, no major issues. And if there are ideas that come up that could get in front of preventing fraud, we'd be more than happy to assist with that.
Neville Boston, Reviver. I did have a question about like Amber Alerts, Silver Alerts, stolen vehicle, things like that. What is the process to be able to have the plate be able to show that kind of information like they do with cell phones and things like that? We don't know if it's, changes that still need to be made to vehicle code. We were very unclear about that. So is there some way that we can get better understanding of the kinds of things that we would need to do in order to put it in place? Because when we go to other states, it's something that comes up, quite often. We're in conversations with Arizona to figure out exactly what that needs to look like. And over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be, working on putting those things together. But, California being the largest state in the union, it sets standards kind of across the board. And it would be great to figure out how, we could potentially work together and what that would look like and what the process should be. Because we're completely in the dark when it comes to that.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. I think we need to look into the statutory requirements to make sure if there's some permissive items that we can leverage, or if we would need to do a statutory change. You know, there's a section here that ties to the vehicle, it has to display, I pulled it up. The alphanumeric characters assigned to the vehicle by the department and evidence of valid registration are capable of and shall be displayed on the device whenever a vehicle is in motion, stationary, parked on or off a road or highway, or unoccupied. So I don't know what kind of flexibilities we might have with that little piece in statute. That to me says the sequence needs to be on there at all times.
Yeah, there's not an issue with sequence being on there. I
Yeah.
mean, that can always be there. It just needs to know, like, what size does it need to be?
That's true.
And those are the questions that, you know, we want to, you know, get clarity on.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of flexibility because it's a digital display on
Sure.
how we could display the information to make sure that it's in compliance. So that would be more, I think, on your side, because we did read that and
Okay.
understand that. And it's just like, you know, how do we approve it? What does the approval need to look like? You know, what size does it need to be? All of those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That's a great question. It's one that is going to require a lot of additional conversations moving forward, because there are, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, our main concern with license plates is that they clearly identify the vehicle.
Absolutely.
Law enforcement has lots of ways of running plates and LPRs and all these things to get responses back about stolen plates or something else that has to do with the car that we need to know as law enforcement. So there has to be, and I really don't have a good answer for you right now, Neville, but there has to be a lot more conversation about how we do that and to what extent the law allows that to be done and under what circumstances, and then who has to give approvals. There's still a lot to be done there. And, you know, it's great that your plate is, in essence, a living plate, right? You're able to make changes over the air, and that provides benefits, but again, that main purpose has to remain fixed and in place, and how we go about it. I think there's a lot of conversation that has to be had before anything like that could take place.
No, 100%, and that's the reason why I'm bringing it up,
Yeah.
so that we can actually start thinking about it and figure out, you know, an intelligent way to do it.
No, it's a great question.
And I think what you're asking for would require a legislative change.
Yeah.
Because there is statute that specifies the size of the characters. And so if you were to shrink it down to half the plate, because you wanted to display an alert, so now you're technically in violation of statute because the characters are not the correct size. But then what happens when the alert goes away and now they're back to full size? So where'd the violation go, right? So that's the question. And I know that we have to think about what's the intent, and then, as Mark said, what's the overall purpose of the plate? And even then, we would have to think, okay, are there different reasons why we want to shrink those down? So maybe there's when it's parked and not moving,
Correct.
is there advertisement on there, versus is there a safety message? And does a safety message have a heavier weight than a financial one?
Yep, makes total sense. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Moving on, we had questions about reporting. The statute does require reporting for the products, and it's, as we look at this for a regulatory scheme, want to think about what kind of frequency, what kind of content, like number of participants, incidences of fraud and misuse, malfunctions and remedies, and then the process. So, John, you had mentioned, you know, meeting in person, or just meetings, having meetings, didn't have to be in person nowadays with the distance, as well as all those technological options that are available to us. So meetings, what kind of frequency would that be? What would it look like? You know, Neville, you had expressed just a forum to communicate. So we want to be thoughtful about what we put in the regulations for this to make sure it's sustainable and appropriate.
Neville Boston from Reviver. When you're talking about the modernization that the DMV is doing, and it's happening across the country, with almost every state that we're working in, there's something going on. In Arizona, for instance, we partnered with IBM/Kyndryl to get an integration into their system, APIs that we could call to do streamlined registration renewal and other things like that. With California, going through the same process right now, what kinds of things are going to be put in place? What kinds of API calls will be available? Because a lot of what you're saying, like cost, could be mitigated by, being able to have a digital integration that you would be doing anyways, and we would be tying into. And I guess part of the conversation that I didn't really say as articulately as I should have is that as you're updating your systems, there will be changes to how the BPA program, I think, is probably administered and what that looks like to a certain extent, depending on, new ways of connecting. And with that being said, if you have companies that want to engage with you, what does that engagement look like? And then, is there a cost to integrate? And that would be more or less the cost that I think makes it, total sense when it comes to working with the DMV, because what the hope is that you stop having a person do it and it's more of an interaction that way.
Right.
Because that's the reason why I think BPA was so, potentially, popular, is that you're moving some of that work, some of that manual work away, and you're putting it on the vendor to take care of that and access your system. So I'm just, putting that out there as it's being developed. Those are things that should be thought about, because if you're wanting to cut costs, definitely a way to do it and be a lot more effective about the data and have a richer set of data coming back to you as well.
Yeah, that's interesting, because as, thinking about that, it sounds like we wouldn't necessarily need you to report to us on the number of participants, because
No.
theoretically, we should have that at our own disposal.
Yeah,
at
and you
any
guys
time.
can decide whether you want to push or pull that information. I know with certain states, we'll set up like a quick site that, will give you all the information about the people, and then whatever data sets that you're expecting to see and receive, that could all, be shown there as well. And you could work through like, hey, we expect it to look like this, and this is the information that would be helpful, and we can make sure that that's information that we're collecting and that we're pushing over to your system or your system's pulling.
Okay. I think we want to be mindful too of other vendors' capabilities and that sort of thing. So I'm trying to think about it from, we talked, low tech, no tech, high tech. And we've got that for the products, but also perhaps for some of the smaller vendors and things like that. So we want to be.
cost of doing business.
Yeah. We just want to be mindful that we're considering all various scenarios. So, thank you. I appreciate that. We are actually looking at, we're almost at the end. So there were some other things that we had for regulatory consideration, but before I do that, Frank, I want to check with you one last time. It's all about the.
All good. No incoming email questions.
Okay, all right, so some of the other items, we talked a little bit about the automated license plate readers, the ALPRs, earlier. A couple of other things were copyright issues. I'm not sure if that's part of the, onboarding as a pilot product or permanent product, that your product is copyrighted. I don't know that the state cares or not. And also, we talked a little bit about ensuring that law enforcement is aware of what's authorized. What are some other things that we haven't talked about today that we need to consider as we move toward our regulatory process? Again, it's that 2 o'clock in the morning, where you go, so email us. Given the technological issues we had this morning, we do plan to host another workshop, so definitely you'll have another opportunity to voice your thoughts, and always you can email that email link, DMV ROD registration policy @dmv.ca.gov. I think when we created that email box, I don't think we expected broad use like this, because that's a really long email box name, a real long email address. Okay, so if there are no other comments, then, it's 11:20, I won't belabor the issue. One thing I wanted to share was next steps. I don't know how familiar you in the room are with regulatory processes. So our next step is to start drafting or continue our drafting of regulatory language based on feedback we've had here today. And then we will, again, we're planning on hosting another workshop so that folks that weren't able to join today can have an opportunity to provide their perspectives. But when we're done with the regs, I guess done in air quotes, they will go through our review process internally, and we'll have other stakeholders look at it. And when I say done, I mean CHP has already been part of that process. Then our legal division will submit the regulations package to the Office of Administrative Law, where they will put out a notice in their notice register, and that's a 45-day notice. The law does require us, this particular statute requires us to conduct a hearing, so we will have at least one public hearing on the regulations. And if there are substantive comments or changes that we have to make to the initial regulatory package, we will go through another 45-day process. But we are working diligently to get the regulations in place for January 1, 2024, which is the date the bill is looking for them. So with that, I wanted to ask you guys, do you have any other comments or anything?
No comments, just thank you for the conversation, thank you for the input. It was nice to hear from all of you, nice to be a part of this public forum, and we look forward to future opportunities to answer questions and engage in this regulatory conversation.
Yeah, likewise, thank you. I appreciate hearing from each of you that spoke, and even those that that sent in comments as well, and everybody's opinion is equally valued, so thank you.
Absolutely, ditto. So, thank you.
A question just came in. This is more for the vendors, potential vendors. One quick question. Is there an ability for the digital license plates to be reflective?
They are reflective. They're not retro-reflective, they are reflective. So the answer is yes.
Not retro-reflective, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Neville.
Well,
All right, well, I should close it pretty quickly, right?
yeah, before something else.
Yeah, exactly. Seriously, though, again, thank you all. You have the email address, DMV ROD registration policy at dmv.ca.gov. Drop us any additional comments you think of, please, and we'll look forward to partnering with you as the regulatory process continues. And then we'll go from there, and I want to thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like applauding. I feel like